Good evening, everybody. This is Charlie Weaver, responding to the questions and the assignment we have for this week about the role of the government in higher education and higher education funding. I'm hoping this is going to work a little bit better. I actually try to write mine out so that I would know where I'm trying to go, so I won't kind of loop around so many times as I did last time we did this. Hopefully that will work out and it won't be too distracting. I'm trying to read it and not look at the camera and not just be kind of all over the place. So basically what I found out was after reading the articles, my eyes got really opened up to how complicated and convoluted the funding and budgeting for higher education really is, especially when you look at it from the federal government side and from the state side. It was very interesting to see the drastic differences in the readings that we had on the Obama budget versus the congressional budget action brief that we had. I found that the presidential budget brief was extremely detailed, had it broken down in different sections, had those sections listed as to what the money was going for, what it was going to do, and if he was reducing something, he explained why he was reducing it and where the money was going. But then when you got to the congressional part, they didn't look at it in that detail. They looked at it, I guess, in the larger budget, the larger picture, which probably for them was so that they didn't have to debate it so much, and that would allow them to process it and get it through. And I guess they expect the president to have those details in there with his people, and they're just funding the dollar amount, which I can see, but it's just very different to see how the two of them work on that. One of the examples I saw with the presidential budget was that he had a section listed on higher ed that talked about new initiatives. And he had a $1 billion program called the Race to the Top College Affordability and Comprehension or Completion Program. That was one of the new things that he was looking at trying to get funded so that people who weren't able to go to school could, and that also that if they started school they could actually finish it, which was I think a really good idea for the program. There was also the other program that he had funded in his budget that was intended to encourage teachers taking positions in high need areas and working with low-income schools. And the idea there was that if they provided the students with a financial incentive to help them with school, that they would then go work in these locations after the fact and then help students who really needed it in areas that weren't getting it from other places. The sad thing there is what they really didn't talk about too was if they paid the teachers in those low, high-need areas better money and gave the school more money, they probably would need to help students go get schools and then take these positions somewhere else. So there's also in the presidential brief they talked about the lifetime learning credit and the Hope credit and how with the congressional budget they didn't talk about specifics as we're going to increase this or we're going to decrease it, but that their rules and regulations and or their suggestions could then have an impact on those types of credits and other incentives that people would see in the back end through other laws and or regulations that they would pass or promote. So in general, I think that the government, meaning the federal government, believes in higher education is a way to create jobs and grow the economy. But I also saw that there seems to be some discrepancy between what the states looked at or how they interpreted that maybe a little bit. So in the video that we got to watch, where they had a couple of people go up there and talk about the different things, it was very interesting to see the speakers and the information they presented. So the Jennifer Cohen, I think Nick Johnson, is that right? Nick Johnson talked about how the federal government provided funds for a 3-year period for the American Recovery and Investment Act, which was basically there in, I think it was 2009, 10, and 11 to help spur the economy. So, every one of the states, basically what they said was, Jennifer Cohen said, was all the states instantly lowered how much they were providing to the higher education because they were going to then get those funds from the federal government to make that up, which was kind of cool in some ways because then they could use those funds in other areas. But it shows that they saw that was an easy place to make a large cut and then move the funds around. Nick Johnson went on to point out that after the end of the funds were over with, they didn't have them anymore, the states had kind of been premature in that they cut the budgets, but they did not make any kind of concessions or decide how they were going to then fix the budgets once that money was no longer there, and they'd already been cutting them. So they've been using these funds in other locations, but now the money has dried up from the federal government, and they need to somehow refund those organizations or the higher education. And how are they going to do it? They weren't thinking about that. Nick Johnson also was kind of funny. I was lived in Florida for a long time, and I was never a big fond or a big friend of Rick Scott, but he went on to. Nick Johnson went on to kind of quote Rick Scott, who was the governor of Florida in 2012, from his State of the State address, in which Rick Scott said, "Floridians believe in support for higher education. That is the most significant thing that we can do in the short and long term to enhance the economic prosperity in our state." Which is nice. I'm glad he said that, and that maybe he even believes that. But in the multiple years prior to that, Florida had been cutting the support for higher education and education in general to where they had cut it $1,381 per pupil over that period of time. So it had been reduced about $1,400 per student in that several years prior. And in 2012-2013 year, they were on the process of restoring it, but they'd only put back in $59 per pupil. So yes, it's important. Yes, we're going to do something about it, but we're only going to give you this very small amount. Now I understand they have certain things they have to work with. There's only a certain amount of money coming in, but you can't say education is important and then not actually fund it correctly or not fund it at all or do so poorly with it. I do believe that education and higher education and K through 12s are going to be the biggest driver, or one of the major drivers, that in healthcare for our economy for a very long time. And plus, the more people know, the better they know, the better off we're going to be. So funding it and actually giving the students and the teachers the money they need, the schools they need, we need to put our money where our mouth is, as they say, and actually fund it correctly. The other one thing I really want to talk about was the Sallie Mae brief that we read. That was a very big eye-opener into the whole idea of the financial institutions, the guarantors, the process of getting student loans. I found it very interesting that the student loans from the very beginning were a difficult thing for lenders to get behind, that they didn't want to do it, that they didn't see any money in it. And I think over that 20-year period from when they first started it to when Sallie Mae went private, it became one of the biggest businesses out there. I somehow find that whole turning of Sallie Mae from a private entity or a public entity into a private entity seems a little bit shady. That may just be me. The whole idea was to give that a way to provide students loans and help them out through school. And now Sallie Mae is like the largest lender in the area or in the United States for student loans, and that they also, from what the article said, basically own the process from inception to completion. So you need the loan, they do the start of the funding, they have all the process along the way. Plus, it seemed like they were very heavily in with a lot of the colleges as to they were the ones who did their financial aid packages, sent out the information. So if we're talking about trying to get students funding, well, that's great. It probably made it easier, and it's a one-stop shop, which is great. But it seems like, from the brief, the original graphic they showed us it was like a 3 or 4 step process for a student asking for a loan, to getting the loan, to getting it to school, and so on. And then after Sallie Mae got into it further and further, and they started to privatize it or get closer to it, then there was like 7 or 8 steps, until the final thing there's like 20 steps. And there's all these people taking a little piece of that student loan along the way, which keeps increasing and increasing and increasing it until it's one of the biggest problems I think we really have. That's one of the things I do find quite a bit of, is they always talk about the cost of higher education, and the first thing, or one of the biggest things I always hear them talk about, is like the cost of the books and tuition and the fees, which all of those have some impact on it. But when you really look at the cost of books, those aren't really as bad as it could be, and I think there's some easy corrections there, or some changes that can be made that would keep the cost of the books much lower. I think the real big cost of higher education is really in that loan process. We look at what a student ends up owing when they get out of school, and that's based on what it costs to actually go. But then it's that plus the interest that they've had to defer, that they deferred for that 4 or 5 years. Now you're talking, instead of it just being $20,000 I owe for school, now it's another $25,000 or $30,000 depending on what the interest rate was and things like that. So the real cost of the school isn't just one element; it's a bunch of them. And I think there's an opportunity to kind of look at that more cohesively than just saying it's just this one thing. So overall, I think that the federal government being in our process of helping us get loans and things like that is a needed service. I think the states are needed too. I think their funding of higher education is important, as well as K through 12s. But I really think that the process and what they do to get the loans to the students and what they do to get the money to the schools needs to be simplified. It seems like anytime a government gets involved, it gets worse and worse, and it may because of different reasons. But we need to keep that in check and not let it grow out of necessity. We need to make sure we always remove all those obstacles, make it where the students can get the money, the colleges can get the money, and that they can cut out all these extra businesses that are out there making a lot of money. So one of the other questions, and I want to make sure I addressed it if I didn't in the first part, was about do I agree with the government's fiscal priorities for higher education? It didn't really state whether or not that was federal or state. In general, I think the president had the priorities of higher education and K through 12s in there. I think in his budget it was very clear that it gets a little bit more convoluted or unclear when I look at the Congress. It seems that they have a strong belief in supporting that. I think it's how they go about doing it, and that they don't look at the individual elements. They look at the whole pieces of the pie they're trying to cut up, which becomes a bit more difficult. And the fact that they really can change the outlook or the outcomes of college or the people who go to it by not just voting on how much budget they get, but also on what incentives there are for taxes as well. I think overall, especially with the growth of education in the last 25, 30 years, both the federal and the state governments see the need for it and see the idea behind it. I think they're just not seeing the big picture as long-term as they really need to be. So I'm hoping over time that they'll really start to invest in the K through 12s and the higher ed, so that the money is there long-term for everyone to grow. So that then provides the incentive economically for people to pay back into the system through paying taxes, having jobs, and hopefully then providing money to the schools through their alumni and things like that. So overall, I do think the government, federal government, state government support higher ed. I just think they do it kind of oddly and at different times, and sometimes based on a convenience. And I think they forget that when it goes into a recession, that's when it probably needs to be done the most. And we'll see how things go. Hopefully this answered the questions. Hopefully you guys got something out of this. I'll be interested to see how everybody else had their take on it. Talk to y'all later. Bye.